Thank you for tuning in to the latest edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. Whether you're listening during your commute, while working out, or just relaxing at home, we appreciate you. Every download, every listen, and every subscription means a lot. Up next, the 12 Kyle podcast.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. Thank you for downloading. And thank you for subscribing to the latest edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. I am your boy, 12 Kyle. Man, check this out. On this episode, what I wanted to talk about was names, more specifically older names. I came to this episode just because of a conversation that I recently had with my 18-year-old son, Brandon. Now, Brandon is currently a high school senior. He's about to graduate at the time of this recording. And what's interesting was he was telling me about, he'd asked me about going to a party. And so the conversation goes something like this. He was like, "Hey, Dad, can I go to this party?" I was like, "Well, who's having a party?" He's like, "Oh, it's a surprise party for one of my friends." I said, "Well, does this friend have a name?" And he said, "Yeah, his name is Preston." And I stopped for a second. And I was like, "Is that his real name?" And he looks at me, he goes, "Yeah, that's his real name." And I had to pause for a second because I'm like, there's a 17 or 18-year-old kid in your class named Preston? To me, like, Preston's an old name. Like, it's a name for old people. It's an old black name, right? And so my next question was, well, is he named after his father? And he said, no. I said, well, is he named after his grandfather? He was like, I don't think so. And he said, why? I said, because Brandon. I said, that's an old name. I said, I don't know anybody your age named Preston. I was like, hell, I don't really know a lot of people my age named Preston. I was like, I was like, we're not really making too many Prestons nowadays. And he laughed and said that he had gone to school with a couple of Prestons, which was a surprise to me because I didn't think we were still making Prestons. I could be wrong, but it got me to thinking about, just old school, old black names. And it's interesting because here's the reality. My name is Kyle, right? And I was named by my mom in 1972 because she had a white coworker who had the name Kyle and she loved the name. So she gave it to me. And up until I got to college at South Carolina State University in the fall of 1991, I had never met anybody else black named Kyle. And actually, there was a guy and a girl named Kyle on the campus of South Carolina State by the time I got there. And that was it. And most people during that time frame that knew me, I was the only black Kyle that they knew, right? And so it was a rare name for a black kid coming up in the 70s and 80s and the 90s. So I don't have what I would call an old black name. I don't even have an old name. I think it's more modern, I guess. And there are more Kyles now than there ever were. I didn't come across a lot of Kyles, period, black or white, growing up. But so even if you look at the landscape of names, our kids, for example, our oldest son, his name is Dion, modern name. He was named, but I mean, that's my middle name. So he was technically named after me. Our middle son, Cameron with a K. I think is a pretty common name. And then there's Brandon. That's an old school name, but I mean, they're still making Brandons. There's a lot of Brandons running around. And then our daughter, her name is Skylar. There's a ton of Skylars. I mean, so it's not like we gave our kids older names. My wife, his name is Sharice. Sharice is more of a modern name. It's not an old name. You won't find any old people named Sharice. So, we are a family that has, pretty modern names, if you will. There are no Gertrudes in my family. No disrespect to any Gertrudes, but I mean, I would venture to say that we aren't making any more Gertrudes. But yeah, it just got me to thinking, like, obviously a name is very important. So, the question I have for you is, what's your name and where did you get that name from? Because everybody doesn't have the benefit of being named after a parent or a grandparent or something like that. So your name is what sticks with you. Now, your last name may or may not change depending on whether or not you get married or not. And if you get married, if you hyphenate it or you just take your husband's name, whatever the case may be. But ultimately, you know, the name thing is a thing, right? Your name is what you carry with you. It's what your ancestors had. And it's something that you can either big up and take to the next level, or you can sully it, if you will, in the muck, in the mire, if you will. And it's funny because we had this discussion. I think we were on the phone. My man Baylor, shout out to BTG. You know him; he's been on here before. BTG for President and Open Run with BTG are his podcast. He had mentioned on a previous podcast that like he didn't know any Jeremys. And he made mention of the fact that they weren't making any more Jeremys. And then I had to, you know, shoot him a text and say, hey, you do know a Jeremy. If you know, you know. But what's interesting is like even some of my friends, like they all have pretty modern names. Like, well, one of my friends, his real name is Alfred. I can promise you, they aren't making any more Alfreds anymore. He may be the last Alfred around, but you know, that's just how names are. So, when you look around and you start thinking about your friends and you start thinking about it, like for me, I start thinking about like fellow podcasters. Like I'll use my man, Uncle Dolomite from the Too Much Game podcast. Uncle Dolomite's real name is Anthony, right? Anthony was in the 80s and the 90s. That was, you know, it was a lot of Anthony's and they're still making Anthony. So it's not a name that's an old name. But the aforementioned Baylor, his real name is Ronald. I don't think they're making any more Ronalds. And there's no disrespect because BTG, that's my boy. That's my brother. But the reality is like, I don't think they're making any more Ronalds. I could be wrong, but if I went into a third grade class, there's probably not a lot of Ronalds running around. Shout out to Britt from the I Can Talk About This All Day podcast. My homegirl, Britt Renee. Britt, I don't think. Well, you know what? I take that back. There's a lot of Britneys. Britney's still pretty common. So, you know, what I wanted to talk about on this podcast was just, I'm going to go through a list. We're going to take a commercial break first. And when I come back from the other side of the commercial break, I'm going to give you a list of old school names that we just aren't using anymore. And it's nobody's fault, but it's just like we've kind of moved on and they're not being made anymore. Sit tight. We'll be back in just a second. Are you feeling nostalgic for the golden eras of rap and soul music? If so, tune in to the Rap Soul Podcast. We are your weekly journey through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, spotlighting the music and the hidden gems that shaped the soundtrack of our lives. From the powerful beats to the soulful melodies, we bring you the best of the past with fresh insights and stories. Rediscover the music that defined a generation. Subscribe to the Rap Soul Podcast and enjoy the vibes. If you want a podcast where culture, conversation, and life collide, where you get insightful commentary, engaging discussions, and a fresh perspective on everything, then you need to listen to the 12 Kyle podcast. Hosted by the one and only, yours truly, 12 Kyle, a voice that you know and trust. This podcast will bring you thought-provoking moments, compelling stories, and a whole lot of fun. Whether you're a first-time listener or just tuning in, each episode promises to be something new and exciting. So sit back, relax, join 12 Kyle, myself, and my guests as we break down the world around us and give you stories that you've never heard before. From nostalgic throwbacks to everything in between, the 12 Kyle podcast is a front row seat to this conversation. Subscribe now and never miss an episode of the 12 Kyle podcast. where the vibe is always real and the discussion is always worth your time. And just like that, we are back. Once again, it's your boy 12 Kyle. This is the 12 Kyle podcast, and we're talking about old names. I mentioned before the break as to how I came up with the idea of this podcast, but what I want to do now is just kind of really reiterate the point and kind of hammer it home, if you will. So I'm going to give you some names that, we just aren't making anymore. We have, as what me and my boys said, we have removed these names from the paint. So they're no longer in the paint. And these are in no particular order, but they'll be pretty much in alphabetical order. And I just compiled a list. It was a list that I found on the Google machine. So if your name comes up, don't be mad at me. Be mad at Google. Okay. First up, Ann. ANN. Nah, we definitely aren't making any more Anns. Ann was a very popular name in the 60s and the 70s. Started fading in the 80s. Definitely was very few Anns in the 90s. If you found an Ann in the 90s, it was probably because they were named after their mother or their grandmother. But right now, no. Anns are probably extinct. Anna. Not a lot of Annas around either. I went to school and grew up with a few Annas. But everybody that I know named Anna is my age or slightly younger. There's I don't know of any 25-year-olds running around named Anna. Could be. I could be wrong, but I doubt it. Bernice. Ooh. Now you want to talk about a old Southern black name? Bernice. Definitely Bernice. Listen, I don't really know that you're going to find too many white Bernices in the South particularly. But yeah, Bernice is definitely one of those old school Southern names. When I think of Bernice, I think of like a church fan or something in a black church. Claire. Yeah. Outside of Claire Huxtable and the famous J.D. sample, J Dilla sample, song he sampled called Claire for the song Players, which is dope, by the way. Claire, I can't even really say that I knew a lot of Claires growing up. And again, I'm 52, so most of you who are listening are slightly younger than me. And my audience is my prime audience between 30 and 60. So you probably know a couple of Claires, but not a lot. And you definitely don't know any young Claires. I will venture to say that. Charles. Yeah, I don't think they're making Charleses anymore. It's funny because I got a couple of friends named Charles. One of my partners, me and Charles, we talk like every other day. And yeah, there's probably not too many Charles around. Everybody named Charles is older, so do with that what you will. Chris. I don't know about this. Chris made this list, but I think I could be wrong. Maybe some school teacher or Brit's a teacher. She may know. Are we still making Chris's? I don't really know if we've gotten Chris out of the paint just yet. We may have to come back to that one. Deborah. Yes. Deborah is definitely an old school name. It's an old school black name. You can't go but so far without running into a old black Deborah. I don't know if you're going to run into any young black Deborahs. Next up, Derek. I got a homeboy named Derek, D. Lovehall. Shout out to my partner in crime. I don't know. I think if you go into a 5th grade classroom, I think you'll probably find a Derek or two. Not a lot. You'll find Derek, but it's very prevalent. When I was coming up, like you'd have to say Derek and his last name because it was so many Dereks to go around. Francis, male or female. Yeah. I can't tell you that I know any Francis. I'll put it like this: if you go into a 4th grade classroom and you ask somebody and their name is Francis, I'm almost willing to bet that they're named after their father or their grandfather or both. Henrietta. Listen, Henrietta, obviously the female version of Henry. Definitely not making any Henriettas. Hell, are we still making Henrys? Still Henry's out of the paint too? Oh yeah, Henry's probably gone too. Henrietta's definitely out of the paint. Jacqueline. Yeah, I don't really know too many Jacquelines. I mean, in this younger generation, and as I'm saying this, I'm trying to remember like the kids in my Dion's 25, right? At the time of this recording. So I'm trying to think of the kids that would even like his generation, the kids that would have been in his class or Cameron's class. Cameron is 22 at the time of this recording. So I'm even thinking about my kids and then this younger generation that's currently in, middle school and elementary school now. Yeah, Jacqueline, definitely not. Jeremy made the list. Joe, I don't know about Joe's. Joe was very popular and very prevalent because, it's a derivative of Joseph. So we probably aren't making Josephs anymore. But yeah, I don't think Josephs are still around. Mildred, definitely not. Mildred has 1957 written all over it. No disrespect. Mildred, Millicent, yeah, both of those. Yeah, they're not doing those anymore. Monique. Now, here's the thing. Monique was really big in the 70s and 80s. I went to school with and knew a ton of Moniques. I would be surprised if Monique was out of the paint by now. I think that's pretty interesting. I might have to research that. I'm not sure, but at one particular time it was. Myrtle. Listen, there's nobody around named Myrtle. Like if you're under 40 and you are named Myrtle, something's not right. Or somebody just wanted to keep the tradition going by naming their child Myrtle. Ben. Yeah, we ain't really making a lot of Bens. Ben's was running slim in the 80s. Ben's was probably very prevalent in the 70s. But in the 80s, Ben's started slowing up a little bit. And by the time the 90s hit, we had gotten rid of the Ben's. You might not find a lot of Ben's, period, around now these days. Betty. No. There's nothing cooler or more that says youth or old youth than the name Betty. Yeah, if you walked into a second grade classroom and found a Betty, something's not right. Something's not right. Ralph. Nah, Ralph. I know a handful of Ralphs. I know maybe 3 Ralphs. And the 4th Ralph was probably Ralph Tresvant. Ralphs really weren't around like that. Ralphs was a name that was struggling when we were coming up. So yeah, they definitely got Ralph out of the paint. Let's see, there's a couple more here. Earl. Definitely not Earl. Earl is like I'm not gonna say that. I was gonna say Earl is like a mechanic's name. Let me stop. Because I don't want to disrespect anybody. But yeah, when you think Earl, you think hard. You think a hard exterior, old school. Working on a Chevy type guy under a shade tree. Earl. Nah, there aren't any Earls around anymore, as far as younger generation. Let's see what else we got here. Walter. Same. Walter and Earl kind of go hand in hand. Yeah, you'd be hard pressed to find a Walter under 35 years old. Hard pressed. William used to be in the paint heavy. William used to be in the paint very heavy. William, not really in the paint that much. You can go into a 3rd grade classroom and you're not going to find a William. Let's see here. Velma. Definitely not. I don't even know of a Velma. Outside of Velma from the cartoon, Scooby-Doo, I don't think I ever met a woman named Velma. At least none I can think of. Cedric. Nope. Not making Cedrics anymore. And Cedric was pretty hot in the 80s, 70s, and 80s. Pretty hot. It was a pretty big name. Herbert. No. And I know a couple of Herberts, man, and all of them are cool, but yeah, if you find a 10th grader named Herbert, he's named after his father. We got Herbert out of the paint probably in the 90s. Let's see. Rosalind. Yeah, not a lot of Rosalinds left. Stephanie. I'm surprised Stephanie made the list because Stephanie was real heavy in the 80s. Started to tail off a little bit in the 90s, but no, you can't find a lot of Stephanies nowadays. Linda. Yeah. Linda is one of those old school names that was really, really tight and really tough. That probably was, you had a lot of Lindas in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And then in the 80s, it started to tail off. And by the time the 90s came, it just dropped. Like there were no more Lindas being made. There's no Lindas around right now. They're all out of the paint. Let's see. Joyce. I know some Joyces, but they're all my age or slightly younger. Like I don't really know a 40-year-old or a 35-year-old Joyce. I just don't. Mary. Supreme old school. I mean, Mary goes back to the manger. Back to Jesus. Yeah. When you got a biblical name like that, yeah, it's I mean, so it's been around since the beginning of time in essence. But yeah, that's not happening. You won't find too many Marys in a first grade class right now. All right, a couple more. Let's see. Dennis. No, I had an uncle named Dennis. Rest in peace, Uncle Dennis. Yeah, not a lot of Dennises. The Dennises probably fell off in the 90s. Yeah, the Dennises got replaced quickly. And last but not least, Pam. The last Pam that was hidden was, Pam from Martin and Pam Grier. But they're old school, and one was a fictional character. Yeah, Pam has been gone for a minute, man. It's been a minute. Pam had a great run. She had a great run, but time was up. So in conclusion, man, I wanted to have a little fun on this episode and just kind of give you some crazy things that have been going on in my head in conversations. Again, no disrespect to Preston or any Prestons that are watching. I apologize to y'all, but I really thought y'all were out of here. Brandon said that he went to school with one Preston and he's known at least 3 or 4 other Prestons. That was news to me because, again, I didn't know any Prestons. All the Prestons that I knew were older men, like from my church and my hometown and stuff like that. No, it wasn't. There were none of my contemporaries named Preston. So it just goes to show you, particularly in the Black community, because I'm speaking from a Black perspective because I am Black. We've moved on from some names. I mean, like the name game has changed, and it's cool. You're supposed to evolve, but I'd like to walk into a classroom of a third grader, or maybe a kindergarten class, and find a Ben or find a Mary. I don't necessarily know that it's going to happen anytime soon, but ultimately, it's most of us, we don't have any control over the names that we get. We just got to make that name shine because we have that name. And that's going to do it for me. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for checking out this edition of the 12 Kyle Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast. The podcast drops every Thursday at midnight. And from time to time, we will drop bonus episodes on Sundays at midnight. We also have a baby. We have a new baby. It's called the Rap Soul Podcast. It is the intersection where we have discussions about artists and music from the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. It is the best music podcast that you've never heard. So take a listen. You can find that podcast wherever you get your podcast. You can find it on YouTube as well. Make sure that you download and subscribe it. We drop those every Monday. As I mentioned, this particular podcast, the 12 Kyle podcast, is on all streaming platforms. Wherever you're listening, you can get it there. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you for watching. We appreciate it. You can download and subscribe there as well. We're also on social media. Check us out. We're on Twitter X, Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, Threads, and TikTok. So we're a little bit of everywhere. And if you want to contribute financially, there's a couple of things you can do. You can buy merch. We have a merch link in the description box. Click that link and you can buy 12 Kyle podcast t-shirts, hoodies, as well as coffee mugs. We got it for the low. Or you can hit us up on Cash App. $TWELVEKYLE. Again, that's going to do it for me. I am your boy 12 Kyle, just talking about names. We'll catch you guys next time. 5,000. Cheers.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of the 12 Kyle podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure that you hit the subscribe button and share this podcast with a friend who needs the 12 Kyle podcast in their life. Every listen, every download, and every share helps us grow. Thanks for being a part of the 12 Kyle podcast community. We appreciate your support. We will catch you next time. 5,000.